Joining me now is Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump. She is also the host of Nerd Avengers on MaryTrumpMedia.com. Mary, thank you for joining us tonight. What do you think your uncle is thinking tonight?
He's probably doing his best not to think about anything, quite honestly. But I think even he cannot deny, as much as he'd like to, that today he was convicted on 34 felony counts, and that he is indeed a convicted felon, and he's going to have to grapple with the fallout of that. However, having said that, I think the recognition of that won't last very long. We seem to be in a very similar situation to the one we were in after the 2020 election. Privately, he was able to concede that he had lost, but very quickly after that, the humiliation sort of overwhelmed him, and we ended up with the big lie, which led to Stop the Steal, which led to the insurrection. So unfortunately, I do think we need to be braced for a pivot to his attempts, at least, to create another alternate reality in which he can protect himself from what is unquestionably a devastating loss in court today.
The sources that CNN has spoken to have said that Trump is in good spirits, and I leave it to you to decide whether or not that is true. But you may have seen this video of him earlier emerging from the courtroom, walking over to reporters who were standing in front for him to then give a very defiant response to the verdict that had just been read. I wonder, having seen him today, what do you make of his demeanor, the way he carried himself, the look on his face? I mean, you know him very well at this point.
Yeah, he doesn't look defiant to me. He looks defeated. And what he said to reporters outside of the courtroom after the verdict is a version of what he's been saying dozens and dozens of times over the course of the last many months. It's rigged, it's a hoax, it's whatever. And that's what he needs to say. And when he talks like that, he's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince anybody in his base who still needs to be convinced. So I don't honestly think that his statement was convincing. I don't think he even believed what he was saying, but he has no choice because he's incapable of accepting what happened. And he's certainly incapable of admitting that he'd done anything wrong. So that's just going to complicate things for him going forward.
What do you think that Donald Trump's parents would think of the legal predicament that he is now in, that he has now become both the president of the United States and also a convicted felon?
Yeah, I think I think they'd be surprised, quite frankly, by his having ascended to the White House, because everybody was surprised by that. And it just didn't seem to be in the cards. Like, that was not something that he was raised to aspire to. It certainly was something that he'd never given an indication that he would take seriously. But as for the convictions, I don't think my grandmother would be surprised. My grandfather, on the other hand, would do exactly what Donald does. He would blame everybody else. He would counsel Donald to take no responsibility, because my grandfather is the man Donald learned those things from. It's never your fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And quite frankly, I think in some ways that has served as a prophylactic against accountability. But that will only take him so far. You know, he's had this aura of invincibility and impunity for decades now, but clearly he's at the end of that road, and he is finally being held accountable, thankfully.
Speaking of, more from the family tree, your cousin, Donald Trump Jr., he called the United States basically a third world country. Right-wing commentators, they have all been, many of them raising the specter of violence. You said earlier, this is like a moment that we've seen before in the past, but what are you most worried that this could all lead to?
I said this in 2020 before the election, that because we know that Donald was already saying that he wasn't going to accept the results unless he won. He was already saying that it was rigged in case that he lost. So we are in similar territory, except, of course, things are worse and more dangerous than they were 4 years ago. And we saw this yesterday. Michael Fanone, Capitol Police officer who laid his life on the line to protect the Capitol, to protect all of the people in that building, and to protect American democracy, went to the courthouse in New York City and he spoke his mind. Not long after that, his mother's house was swatted. So Donald has long been engaging in stochastic terrorism. He uses his power, his platform, and his influence to get his followers to commit acts of violence on his behalf. That's something we desperately need to look out for. There is nothing this man will not stoop to. If he feels like he's going down, he will absolutely take the rest of us with him. That was true 4 years ago. It's even more true now. It's especially true now that he has finally faced justice. And for anybody on the right to say anything like Donnie said is just despicable. And that, quite honestly, is one of the most troubling things about the way this trial has unfolded. Not just Donald, but every single Republican who stood up for him, including many members of Congress, have come to New York City not to support him, but to undermine the rule of law, which is one of the cornerstones of American democracy. And it's really dangerous.
And quickly, before you go, do you think he should go to jail?
I absolutely think he should go to jail. And that's not just based on the findings here of being guilty, but because of his egregious behavior during the course of this trial.
All right, Mary Trump, thank you very much for all of that.
Thank you.
And for more on this historic night, I want to bring in former counsel to President Trump during the first impeachment, Robert Ray, former Assistant Special Watergate Prosecutor Nick Ackerman, New York Magazine's Washington correspondent Olivia Nuzzi, CNN contributor Leah Wright Rigueur, Republican strategist Joe Pinion, and Democratic strategist Kai von Schroff. Hello, everyone. I'm going to go to Nick first because Nick you have the distinction of being probably the most optimistic lawyer that I have talked to about this case from the very beginning.
From the beginning,
so
and
tonight,
I was right.
Okay, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to gloat. Tonight, seeing a guilty verdict on all 34 counts after 12 hours of deliberation, what do you think happened here?
I think what happened was that he fell under the weight of the evidence. He had no evidence. He had no theory of his case. His lawyers kind of gave sort of just general sort of throwing things at Michael Cohen, coming up with generalities about the entire case itself. The problem was that once the prosecutor got up and went through the evidence and went right to those two exhibits that were the handwriting of Weisselberg and McConaughey that showed how the reimbursement to Cohen was included in those $35,000 payments that added up to $420,000, the whole thing was over. Because that showed exactly what happened. He went through all of the rest of the facts, all of the other witnesses, did it in a very methodical way, did it organized, chronological. The defense really just was scattergun all over the place. They threw things out. It sounded good, but it just got blown away by the evidence. And then on top of it all, the argument being that Michael Cohen is a liar, they absolutely blew that away when they called Costello. Robert Costello to the stand, and it turned out that he wound up being a double agent, as they said in the summation, and showed that he was actually a conduit to Donald Trump through Rudy Giuliani.